All Things Data podcast. In the spirit of Daniel Kahneman, Peter Diamandis, and Google Moonshots, brings together leading data scientists, technologists, business model experts, and futurists to discuss how to utilize, harness, and deploy data science and data-driven strategies to enable digital transformation. The hosts are Dr. Manjeet and Dan, Associate Professor of Data Science, and Dan Yarmala, Director of Business Development of IoT and Data Science. The podcast is produced by the Graduate Programs of Software of the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Louis Rosenberg is a technologist, prolific inventor, entrepreneur, and writer. He attended Stanford University, where he earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees. His doctoral work focused on robotics, virtual reality, and augmented reality. It resulted in the virtual fixture systems for the U.S. Air Force, the first immersive augmented reality system ever built in 1992. Rosenberg then founded a number of successful technology companies, including the very early VR company Immersion Corporation, which went public in 1999, the 3D digitizer company Microscribe, which was used in the making of Shrek, Ice Age, and Titanic, and the mobile augmented reality company Outland Research. Mr. Rosenberg, or Dr. Rosenberg, has also worked as a tenured professor at California Polytechnic State University, and in 2014, he founded Unanimous A.I, an artificial intelligence company that enables human groups to amplify their collective brain power by forming real-time online swarms. So, Dr. Rosenberg, it's great to have you on the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Did we miss anything in your background that you want to point out? I mean, if you did the stuff that was in the making of Shrek, Ice Age, and that kind of stuff, obviously your technology was embedded in my household one way, shape, or form with children. So they don't even know animation anymore.
Yeah, no, it's I've been involved in a variety of different technologies, but I will say the stuff that I'm working on now is definitely the most interesting by far. So it's the most fun to talk about as well.
Fantastic.
So, Louis, you have worked in both augmented as well as virtual reality. Just to start off, if you could help our listeners understand the difference between the two.
Sure. So, virtual reality is basically this idea of creating an immersive simulation where you feel present in a simulated environment, a virtual environment, and it's completely artificial. Augmented reality is the idea that you can overlay a small bits of a virtual reality on top of your view of the real world. And so you could be seeing and hearing and experiencing the real world, but also have virtual objects be present in that real environment. And so for virtual reality, you just wear a headset and you're just seeing simulated things. For augmented reality, you need to be able to view, people call it a transmissive display. You're being able to see the real world, but also have simulated objects presented in your view of the real world. And so augmented reality is harder because you need to be able to have the real world and the virtual world registered so that when you turn your head and there's a simulated object sitting on your desk, it's still sitting on your desk, even though you moved your head in a different direction. And so, but both technologies have made a lot of strides over the last 5 years, and I expect we'll continue to make a lot of strides over the next 5 years.
So something like, let's say, Pokemon Go, for example, would be an augmented, right?
Yeah, so Pokemon Go is a good example of the concept of augmented reality, and there, instead of using a headset, you're using your phone as kind of a window into the real world, but because you're using the camera of the phone and the screen of the phone, you can have this window into this augmented world where you can see a virtual object present in the real world. in the future when those, when instead of it being a phone, it's a headset that you're wearing and you can move your head freely, the illusion of feeling present in this world that has both real and virtual objects in it, that illusion gets a lot stronger when it's immersive, as opposed to handheld like Pokemon Go.
Right. So in recent times, you have been involved in this artificial swarm intelligence, and then your company made a series of accurate predictions in recent times about the 2016 Oscar Awards and the Kentucky Derby. Can you talk about what is swarm intelligence?
Sure. So swarm intelligence ultimately is inspired by nature, and so if you think about where does swarm intelligence fit in the world of AI, it's always useful to say, well, what is intelligence? And the way I like to look at what intelligence is intelligence is basically a system that can take in noisy information about the world and use that information to make good decisions, good predictions, good judgments, good estimations. And back in the early 1950s, when people first started saying, hey, let's try to build an artificial intelligence, they looked to nature and they said, well, how does nature build intelligence? And they looked to the most familiar type of intelligence that we know, our own brains. And for the last 60 years, most of the AI research that's been going on has been looking at, well, how do we build artificial versions of our own brain? And that led to neural networks and a lot of forms of machine learning. And it's really all about trying to build simulated neurons that connect together into systems and have intelligence emerge from these systems of simulated neurons. What we do is we looked at nature and said, you know what? Nature actually has another way it builds intelligence. Yes, it builds neurological intelligence from neurons, but nature also builds what biologists call swarm intelligence from groups. And so what a swarm intelligence is it says that if you bring together a group of organisms and you have them tightly interconnected in a system, that system can have intelligence emerge that is smarter than any of the individual members. And so in a lot of sense, a swarm intelligence is the next level up. If a brain is a system of neurons where intelligence emerges, a swarm is a system of brains where a superintelligence emerges. And again, it's inspired by nature, but it's ultimately why birds form flocks and fish form schools and bees form swarms. They're smarter together when they work together as a system. And if it's helpful, I can give an example of how, for example, bees amplify their intelligence in swarms, because it's remarkable. They can become much smarter together than alone. And so to give you that example, honeybees, first of all, honeybees are very, very simple organisms, right? A single bee has less than 1 million neurons in its head. It sounds like a lot, but a person has 85 billion neurons in your head. And so however smart you think you are, divide that by 85,000, and that's a bee. And so bees are very, very simple, but they have very, very hard problems to solve. So every year a colony of bees will split in two, and a large group of bees, 10,000 bees, will need to go out and find a new home. And so what these 10,000 bees do is they form a swarm intelligence. Now, the first step is that they send out scout bees that go and they search 30 square miles of area to find candidate sites to move into. And by a candidate site, I mean like the hole in a log, or a hole in the side of a building, or a hole in your roof. And so they find dozens of potential sites to move into. And that's the easy part. The hard part is that they then, to maximize their survival, they need to pick the best possible site of all the sites they've identified. But they're but they have a lot of constraints. And so when they're trying to pick the best possible site, what they're doing is they need to pick a home site that's big enough to store the honey that they need for the winter, that's ventilated well enough to stay cool in the summer, that's insulated well enough to stay warm in the winter. It has to be protected from the rain. It has to be near a good source of water. It has to be near good sources of pollen. And so it ends up being this complex multivariable optimization problem. Very, very hard problem to solve. A single bee could not possibly comprehend it. And yet when they work together as a swarm intelligence, they converge on the best possible answer over 80% of the time. A number of biologists have shown how accurate, how able a swarm of bees is to optimize this really hard problem, a problem that a person would have a hard time picking the optimal answer. So how does these, a swarm of these very, very simple organisms solve a problem that a person would struggle to solve? They form a system. They form a system where they think together. They basically think together, and they do it by vibrating their bodies, which is also amazing. So biologists call that a waggle dance, because to people it looks like the bees are dancing, but really they're vibrating their bodies and they're generating signals, and those signals that they're generating are representing their support for the different home sites that are being considered. And so what happens is all these bees are vibrating their bodies, and different factions are forming and dissolving in support of different options until they converge together on the one solution that they can best agree upon. And it's almost always the optimal solution. And so the question that inspired our work and our research is, if a group of bees can amplify their intelligence by forming a swarm, why can't people do it? Why can't people form a swarm intelligence? And so what we've been working on for the last 3.5, 4 years has been to study how natural swarms amplify the intelligence of groups and turn those models into algorithms and interfaces that allow people to do the same thing online. And so we built a system called UNU that allows groups of people to form swarms online and express input in much the same way that birds and bees and fish do, in terms of, but we have a very user-friendly interface for people, because people can't waggle dance, but they can use a mouse and a keyboard and a screen. And when we enable groups of people to come together and answer questions, thinking together as a swarm, we've seen in study after study after study that they are significantly smarter together, able to make better predictions and better forecasts, and by thinking together as a swarm intelligence than they could do on their own, or than they could do by doing like what you would normally say crowdsourcing, like taking a vote or a poll would be traditional crowdsourcing. A swarm is going to be much, much smarter than those other methods.
So that's an interesting idea about swarming. But I was just wondering, how do humans swarm? I mean, are they capable of swarming, first of all? Because if you think about fishes swarming, they follow the vibrations in the water. I think ants perhaps emit some kind of chemicals. But how do humans swarm?
Right. So that's exactly right, which is that all these other species have evolved these methods of doing it over millions of years. And you're right, fish can detect vibrations in the water around them, and birds can detect motion in the flock, and they're able to use these natural methods. We humans didn't evolve any of those methods, and so what we did at Unanimous A.I. is build an interface that allows people to express the same types of sentiments, but in a very human-friendly way. And so what we allow people to do is log into our system and answer questions together as a group. And on the screen, each person is able to control what looks like a little graphical magnet, and that magnet they can freely move it around, and it allows them to express their will, their intent, the direction they want to pull the swarm in. and the angle and the location of their magnet expresses their the direction they want the swarm to go. The closer or further that they move the magnet, they can change their direction of conviction, and so they can express their intent and their conviction, and they can vary it freely. It's not, they're not just clicking a button in a survey. They're continually changing that, and so you could have hundreds of people all varying their opinions in real time and converging on an answer that will maximize their collective knowledge and wisdom and insight and intuition, because they're all working together as a single system where they're pushing and pulling off against each other until they find the solution that they can best agree upon.
Mm-hmm.
Louis, how does the swarm, is it self-organizing, or is it, how is it formed to begin with? I can understand how the convictions are influenced to influence the swarm in a certain direction. That'll lead to
right.
So how does it get formed in the first place? These tribes, flocks, swarms.
Right. So when right now when we're doing a prediction, like predicting baseball games or predicting a stock market or predicting a presidential election, we generally want to have a random sample of people who participate in a swarm, and so we can invite people into a swarm, and they just get a link, and they click on the link, and they enter our platform, and they can participate in the swarm, and then questions appear, and they can all answer the questions together, and so we can create swarms specifically to answer very specific questions. We also, on our platform, which is again called UNU, people can also just log in and create their own swarms. They can basically create a room and invite their own people into that room. And we've had people say, hey, they want to create a swarm that can predict the price of Bitcoin, and so they'll invite a bunch of people who know something about Bitcoin into the swarm, and then they can ask questions and predict the price of Bitcoin. And so we allow groups to organically form on their own. We also do very specific swarms, and we do it often, to target very specific problems. You had mentioned in the introduction, one of the things we had predicted was the Kentucky Derby, and that was done because we were challenged by a journalist at CBS Interactive. Said, hey, let's see you predict the Kentucky Derby. And so to have a swarm that can predict the Kentucky Derby, we need people who know something about horse racing, right? And so what we did was we had put an online advertisement out asking for people who are horse racing enthusiasts, not professionals, just enthusiasts, and people responded, and we brought together a swarm of people in the platform and asked them to predict the Kentucky Derby. And the goal there on that particular project was not just to predict the winner, but to predict the first 4 horses in order. And in horse racing, that's called the superfecta. And last year it went off at 540 to 1 odds. So it's a very hard thing to predict. But what we did was we had this swarm of people, and we asked them a series of questions where they would, because there's 20 horses, they started with the 20 horses, and through a series of questions, they narrowed it down to a set of 4 horses, and then through another series of questions, they ordered those 4 horses, and they made their set of predictions, and then the reporter published her story, and she actually went to the Kentucky Derby and placed a bet on the superfecta, and she tweeted out her ticket, and so put a lot of pressure on us, and remarkably, the swarm was perfect. They perfectly predicted those 4 horses in order, which meant that anyone who had placed a $20 bet on those 4 horses would have won $11,000. That's how difficult of a prediction it was. And the remarkable thing is not that the swarm got it right, but that if we look at the individuals, because we always ask individuals before they enter the swarm just to tell us their individual opinions. If you look at the individuals who are in the swarm, not a single one of them got all 4 horses right. But when they work together as a system, pushing and pulling and combining their knowledge and wisdom and insight, they were perfect. And that's, swarms aren't always perfect, but what we always see is that the swarm is significantly more accurate than the individuals who make up the swarm.
So I want to go back a little bit, Louis, to what you said about in your UNU system, you allow people to form their own swarms. So let's say me and my buddies already agree on the price of a Bitcoin, or we all agree already on who should be winning a particular Best Actor award. And so, we all end up getting into that one swarm, but there is no, movement. There is no convergence. There is no change of opinions happening. Is my understanding correct in that case?
That is true. So if you have a group of people and they all agree, then the swarm is a very, very simple, quick swarm where they're basically just going to go straight to that one answer. And that certainly happens. I mean, there are questions where everybody agrees. And that's a case where the value of a swarm versus just a vote really doesn't exist, because you could have just taken a vote. If everyone agrees, you could just take a vote and you get the same answer. So swarms are generally most powerful when you have a number of options, not just two. I mean, you certainly can do it with two, and we do it a lot, but if you have a variety of different options and diversity in the population where there's not a single obvious solution, well, now the swarm really can start to tap into their different knowledge and conviction. And a good example that we did on that kind of shows this is Newsweek challenges to predict the Oscars. And so for the Oscars, there's each category has 6 or 8 different choices, and there's generally maybe for some questions there might be a favorite, but usually there's it's hard to predict the Oscars. And so what we did was we formed a swarm of 50 movie fans, and these were not experts; these were just fans, and we had them form a swarm on the UNU platform. And then we asked them to predict each of the categories. And so the questions would pop up one after another, and they would work as a swarm. And what we did was we looked at how did the individuals predict first on their own. And as individuals by themselves, just predicting the Oscars, they were 40% accurate, which isn't great, but predicting the Oscars is hard. But those same 50 people, when they worked together as a swarm, they jumped all the way up to 76% accurate in predicting the Oscars. And so so by forming a swarm, they became far more significant. But the issue that's really interesting is we asked those people, well, how many of you have actually seen all the movies? None of them had seen all the movies. And that's really the power of the swarm, is that they, they're going to fill in the gaps in each other's knowledge. They're going to, because you're capturing not just an opinion, but a level of conviction. And so people who have high conviction or high confidence because they might have seen a particular film or they're passionate about a particular question, that will be accounted for compared to somebody else who maybe on a particular category didn't see many of the films or doesn't have a strong opinion. And so with when a swarm is the most powerful when people don't have, when every individual person doesn't have the full set of information. Each person might have just partial sets of information, which is how most issues are, and yet you want to combine their knowledge and wisdom in an efficient way. A swarming is nature's way of doing it, and that's really how it works with bees and birds and fish. Honeybees, each bee maybe has only visited a few of those sites that are out there in the world. No single bee has the complete set of knowledge, but they can combine their knowledge and wisdom together in a way that allows them to reach an optimal answer.
Mm-hmm. Louis, what was the genesis for you with the idea of productionizing swarm technology and data science? Like, what was the connection? Like, for me, I got interested in cognitive bias when I read Thinking Fast and Slow of probably Daniel Kahneman, right? So it's psychology. So I'm kind of, which it clicked for me over the weekend when I was getting excited for the interview, was like Unanimous A.I, perfect description, It's the wisdom of the swarm, wisdom of the crowds. So I totally get it. But what was the genesis of the idea?
Yeah, it's a good question. So as I mentioned at the start, I started out my personal, experience in technology in human-computer interaction, and was involved in very early days of virtual reality and augmented reality. And in fact, my doctoral work, which was back in the early 90s, was really focused on how to use virtual reality and augmented reality to amplify the ability of individuals. And so I've really, for my whole career, have been interested in how can we use technology to make people smarter or make people perform better. And when I was working in virtual reality and augmented reality, it was really about amplifying the abilities of a single person. And amplifying the abilities of a single person is really interesting. But as I worked in this field over time, I started to realize, you know what, it's even more interesting to look at groups of people because groups of people are far more complex and a lot more interesting things are happening. And that's when I realized that, hey, nature has been amplifying the intelligence of groups of organisms for millions of years. Bees have been forming swarms for 30 million years. There's probably a lot of insight if we can study how nature does it, and the more I started to study how nature can amplify the intelligence of groups, I realized that there's really no reason why people couldn't benefit from this same thing. And really, if you think about honeybees, which their brains are so simple. Again, their brains are smaller than a grain of sand, and yet when they form a swarm intelligence, they can solve really complex problems that would be hard for a person. So then, of course, it raises this question of, if people could swarm in the most efficient way, we should be able to solve problems that we can't even conceive of. And so it's, to me, a really exciting problem, and one that we're really at the very start of. I mean, what we've done is convince ourselves very strongly that people can swarm and they can amplify their intelligence, but we're just at the start of what this type of technology can evolve into. And I say that just by looking at the natural examples. The level of amplification of intelligence that birds and bees and fish can do is really huge. And for humans, we've been seeing people get smarter. We've been seeing people get twice as accurate in predicting baseball games, for example. But the potential is there for people to get 10 times more accurate or 10 times smarter as the technology matures.